Now, Nigel Farage has had, by his own admission, a literally painful campaign. He's in poor physical shape and he's fighting for his political life. If he doesn't win a seat at Westminster, he says it's curtains for him. So there's a lot at stake for the leader of UKIP. And Mr Farage joins me now. Good morning to you.
Good morning.
How are you feeling? Because I read your book and I have never come across a politician who's had so many scrapes and near-death experiences as you.
I have had a few, but then you've been through a bit of trauma yourself and you're back here doing the programme. And
So
I did at the early part of the campaign have a bit of a bad back. Men are not always very good at looking after their health, and I wasn't going for physio and treatment, and now I am, and I'm fine.
Physio are absolutely essential. Now, David Cameron has made it clear several times recently that he doesn't think you're going to get any seats at all.
I know. It's Desperate Dave, isn't it? Desperate Dave saying to these voters that have left him over the course of the last 5 years, please come home, I think is the phrase he uses. They're not going back to a guy that's covered the country in windmills, that has slashed our armed forces, raised the level of the foreign aid budget, presided over massive immigration, and only at the last minute been persuaded to sort of half-heartedly offer a referendum. Those voters aren't going back. And it's actually a misreading from him and the press. Most UKIP voters have not come to us from the Conservatives. They're coming from Labour, a few from Lib Dems, and a huge chunk of our vote is coming from people who were completely outside the political process but see UKIP as offering hope. Now,
I started off talking about the numbers with Yvette Cooper, and I'll do the same thing here. Your raw polling numbers haven't moved much in the last 6 months or last year or so.
Well, there's been a very
about the same, around 13%.
There's been a very desperate attempt to talk UKIP down over the last month. Every commentator, every pollster. And one or two of the pollsters using voodoo science to try and produce quite low numbers, but not even prompting UKIP. The fact is, not only are people who say they're going to vote UKIP more likely to go to the polling station next Thursday than the other parties, we're actually going up in the polls. And I have to say, I think with 4 days to go, if only we could debate the big issues rather than who's going to get into bed with whom next Friday morning.
There's a lot of bed hopping going on at the moment. But if you look at the raw numbers, I was going to say then the pollsters extrapolate and they don't give you very many seats. Do you reflect that this is possibly the last, this is the general election which breaks our current voting system?
I do, and you know, my message to people, obviously we've got our key target seats where we think we're going to win or we're very, very close to winning, but I would say to all UKIP voters that a vote for UKIP is a vote for change, not just in terms of the policy and direction of the country, but for a change in our voting system. First past the post is now bankrupt.
OK, looking at the Conservative message, however, you've said a lot about the danger of the SNP and the Scottish Nationalists holding the whip hand in Westminster and so forth. Isn't David Cameron absolutely right when he says in Labour, Tory and marginals, you'd be bonkers to vote UKIP if you want to keep Nicola Sturgeon out of Westminster? You have to vote Conservative to ensure David Cameron back in, and therefore no SNP Ed Miliband stitch-up.
Well, I'm not sure what the Labour Party's position with the SNP is. I mean, that seems to change every day. But it's a bit ironic for the Conservative Prime Minister to say he's the great defender. And they've put up billboards showing Alex Salmond taking money out of an English back pocket. This from Mr Cameron, who joined the pledge with Miliband and Clegg to guarantee in perpetuity the Barnett formula, and the English continuing to shovel money over Hadrian's Wall. If you want some MPs in Westminster to fight the SNP, you'll need some UKIP ones.
Now, you've been described by Vernon Bogdanor, a constitutional expert, your party, as a nascent English nationalist party. Is there some truth in that?
We are the only party represented in all four, electorally represented in all four corners of the United Kingdom. Some of our polling stats in Wales are better than our polling stats in England. So no, in England and Wales, we're strong. In Northern Ireland, we have a presence in Stormont. In Scotland, we won an MEP seat there last year. And I think what's really also been completely misread is the extent to which UKIP has grown in the Midlands and the North in Labour-held seats. And the commentators just aren't seeing it.
Let's talk about policies a bit. You told John Humphreys, I noticed the other day, that the BBC was an anachronism or a dinosaur. I can't remember. Obsolete, I think was the word.
All three would do.
All three would do. What would you like to see actually happen to the BBC? Well, would you like to see it go completely?
No, I think the BBC as a public service broadcaster has a role. I think the BBC as a global brand for this country is very, very important. But I think the BBC is far too big and has far too much influence.
What kind of things would you like to see the BBC stop doing?
Well, I don't think it needs to do entertainment, for example.
So Doctor Who and all that kind of stuff could go.
Well, the point
Vote
is, we now have lots of commercial channels out there. We have cable television. The BBC does not need to be doing all of these things. And I think there is a
Strictly Come Dancing, all of that kind of stuff.
I think there is a real question. About the BBC website and about local news, because, and I say this because if we believe in a free press, then if the BBC local websites are as strong and as heavily funded as they are, how can local newspapers or local websites even compete? And so there is a problem that actually, out in the regions, the BBC is beginning to obliterate other voices in the media.
So you'd like to see the end of BBC Entertainment and the website. How would you like to see this process taken forward? I mean, you've got views, the DUP have views, many Conservative MPs have views. What should happen?
The whole debate about the BBC licence fee and its role, is coming up over the next 2 to 3 years, and I want UKIP to have some input into that. I mean, the other problem is that UKIP was adjudged by Ofcom to be one of the 4 major parties in British politics, and frankly, the BBC have not treated us like that during this general election campaign.
OK, let's move on to another area of policy, because you had almost a second manifesto, which was the Christian manifesto, which you put your name to early on, which came out with lots of policies and so forth. Can I ask you, first of all, are you yourself a Christian?
Yes, I'm a confirmed member of the Church of England. I haven't always approved of its recent leadership, and I'm a little bit lapsed, but I am a member of the Church of England. Yes.
In that manifesto, there's a very interesting bit about gay marriage, and you say there's a phrase you would use: reasonable accommodation to help people who are against gay marriage. And I just want to know what that actually means.
Look, let's just be clear. We have now an active and growing LGBT group within UKIP, lots of gay candidates standing for us in these elections. There's been a sort of another establishment attempt to paint UKIP out to be anti-gay. That is rubbish.
I'm just asking you what it means.
But what we say is that all minorities deserve respect, and that actually, yes, gay people deserve their rights, but also Christians and Muslims, for that matter, should be allowed to hold a reasonable position that says they don't approve of some lifestyles. And that is an accommodation.
I understand, but just be absolutely clear. I'm running a B&B. I don't approve of gay people. Under reasonable accommodation, would I be able to say to them, I'm terribly sorry, don't come in?
Well, that would be open prejudice. But, Andrew, our national
just
debt...
Just give me an example.
No, I'm not going to. I'll tell you why. Our national debt has doubled in the last 5 years. 624,000 migrants settled in Britain last year. All you and anybody else wants to talk about is some tiddly piece of our manifesto. I'm sorry, some tiddly piece of our manifesto. The only manifesto,
all right, well, the only
fully costed manifesto that has been put to the British public at this election.
Well, let's talk about the big costing parts of your manifesto then.
Please.
The House of Commons Library says that if we left the EU and we were on the same basis as Norway, we would be able to cut our contributions by 17%. Worth having, but nothing like the huge amounts of money that you want.
Who is suggesting that the model we would have with the European Union would be the same as Norway's?
Well,
yes,
Norway they're able to trade, that's the point.
Well, there are 60 countries around the world that have free trade deals with the European Union.
So you're saying we wouldn't be in the European Trading Pact, or the EEA?
We are now the Eurozone's biggest export market in the world. They sell us about 1 million motor cars a year more than we sell them. They need us in terms of trade more than we need them. We will have our own free trade deal with the European Union, and it'll look a bit like the thing my parents thought they were voting for 40 years ago in the referendum. Friendship, free trade, cooperation, but the ability to make our own global trade deals with the emerging economies of the world, many of which, incidentally, are in the Commonwealth.
Now, I'm going to be talking to Nick Clegg in just a moment, and I'm sure we'll come on to the subject of an EU referendum. How optimistic are you that a Conservative-dominated government will deliver a referendum that's a fair one?
I'm not confident at all. I mean, Mr Cameron once before promised a referendum, then he broke the promise, then he spent 2 years saying it wasn't in the national interest, then he saw UKIP spreading like a purple rash across the country and decided he'd offer a referendum. If he held that referendum on his own, without UKIP holding his feet to the fire, I am not confident it would be a full, free and fair referendum.
A lot of talk about red lines in this election. If there's a bunch of UKIP MPs in the House of Commons able to influence what happens, then presumably your first red line will be the terms and conditions of that referendum.
Yeah, it's got to be full, free and fair. And I've seen some really twisted referendums held all over Europe. It has to be both sides have to have the same spending limits. There needs to be an ombudsman to make sure that organisations like the BBC give both sides of the argument fair play.
Okay.
And we also need to define who votes.
I find it slightly hard in these circumstances to see how we could have an arrangement with David Cameron, Nigel Farage and Nick Clegg in any kind of arrangement. Impossible?
Well, if Nick Clegg... I mean, look, I don't want to go into coalition with anybody. You know, I don't want a ministerial car.
No darkened
But
rooms.
I would like to help drive the agenda. And I'm quite certain that if Nick Clegg wants to be Deputy Prime Minister next time round, that he will change his mind and support a referendum.
Well, we'll see very shortly.
We will.
For now, Nigel Farage, thank you very much indeed. Well, Nick Clegg's still with me, so is Yvette, and so is Nigel Farage. Now, I can almost do the kind of little bits of coloured wool. You would do a deal with him. You would not do a deal with him. You might do a deal with him, and you wouldn't do a deal with her.
I wouldn't do a deal with him.
You wouldn't do a deal with him. So I'll take snips and wool.
He and I have debated. There's no meeting point, I think.
No, I mean, look, we don't want to go into coalition with anybody. You know, whatever strength we have in the next Parliament, all we want to do is to make sure the British people get a full, free and fair referendum on their membership of the EU and whether we have open borders or not.
But you also want to take away Strictly Come Dancing. That's terrible. That's much more important than
The
any
big difference in the
referendum.
end, both these two men would happily do a deal with David Cameron and put him back into Downing Street. That's what we won't do. That's why in the end, Labour's the only alternative choice.
There has been no bloodier and more aggressive tribal fight than between Labour and the Liberal Democrats. Is there any possibility that you could put all that behind you and talk to Nick Clegg? I mean, your party's been very rude about Nick. Could you talk to him?
We're challenging him again today. But you've just been discussing tuition fees, and Nick says that he didn't want to put up tuition fees, but he's still opposing us in reducing them. Would you allow an increase in tuition fees?
Yvette,
will you rule out an increase in tuition fees?
Can I just... Education.
Will you rule out an increase in tuition fees?
You are not going to have youngsters going to university if you don't support nursery schools and colleges.
So you won't rule out a further increase in tuition fees?
Why do you want to cut the money to nursery schools and colleges?
You won't rule out a further increase in tuition fees. We'll protect the education budget, but we will also cut tuition fees.
You will cut it by £2.5 billion.
And help you both out. I'd like to hear from Nick Clegg. You've said you're very worried about the Labour Party being propped up from the outside by the SNP. If they were genuinely outside, if there was no deal, do you think you could do a deal with the Labour Party?
I'd be very open about the fact that there's no way the Liberal Democrats are going to enter any deal, arrangement or pact with the SNP or UKIP. Sorry, Nigel.
No, that's all right, boy.
But of course, you've got to be grown up about it. Both Ed Miliband and Yvette, and of course, the Liberal Democrats. We are the only party who are grown up enough to say that since no one is going to win, I know Yvette and Ed Miliband and David Cameron
yellow lines, green lines, blue lines. It's like
what I won't accept.
You may have to talk together. In the end,
you really have to kind of get over this. You're not going to win a majority, and you and indeed the Conservatives have to be more upfront with the British people. You're not going to win a majority, and we would never accept the cuts that you want to impose.
We've got 4 days to go.
No, wait a minute. You're the party.
Can we not in the last 4 days? Can we not in the last 4 days?
We normally
policy. Can we talk about policy?
We normally finish this programme with lovely music. We have had some glorious disharmony today. Thank you all very much indeed for the cacophony.